Okay, so good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us. This is another webinar that we're holding as a part of a series of webinars we're holding for startups and product development. And today we're especially thrilled to have a guest in our webinar, Diana, who is a GDPR representative and specialist, and she will discuss GDPR aspects in vendor selection and management by the sponsor. And Rivka from Address will discuss the GCP aspects. Diana, if you can introduce yourself to our audience, please. Just please unmute.
Hello, I'm Diana Andrade. I'm the founder and managing director of RD Privacy, a privacy consulting firm to support sponsors in clinical research to ensure compliance with GDPR and local data protection legislation.
Thank you very much, Diana. And again, I'm very happy to have you here. And we will start with Rivka's presentation, followed by Diana's presentation. And on that time, you please feel free to ask questions in the Q&A. And eventually, we will go over the questions and answer them. And hopefully, we'll have some time for an open discussion between Rivka and Diana. So just a few words about Address before we begin. We are a consultancy. We work with startup companies in the biopharmaceutical, pharmaceutical, and medical device industry. We provide regulatory, scientific, quality, and CMC advice and assistance. And today we are focusing on our expertise on GCP and its requirements from the sponsors. So please, Rivka, feel free to start.
Hi, good afternoon to all. I will share my screen, just a second. Okay, I hope that you can see my screen. So as we already mentioned, the topic of today is the sponsor responsibilities on vendor selection and management during clinical trials. I will focus on the GCP aspects. My name is Rivka Zeibel. I am the president and founder of Address, and I have 36 years of experience in the pharmaceutical area. So as probably you all know, in May 2023, an ICH GCP draft guideline, the revision 3, was published, and that guideline enlightened us, giving detailed expectations regarding the sponsor oversight and responsibilities of all parties involved. Vendor selection and management is addressed in details in the new version of the guideline, as opposed to previous version, which mentioned that there should be a sponsor oversight, but it was not as detailed as it is now. In the following slides, I will present the different vendors which are required for successful clinical trial conduct and management. How should they be selected and qualify, and the control tools that can be implemented throughout the study conduct. So I will start by quoting a few words from the guideline. Section 3.9.1 says that the sponsor should ensure that the trial design and trial conduct, the processes undertaken, and the information and data generated are of sufficient quality to ensure reliable trial results, trial participant safety, and appropriate decision-making. And the tools that are detailed in the guideline are risk assessment prior to first protocol finalization, vendors selection and qualification and requalification, principal investigators selection and clinical site audits, clinical operations and QA review of monitoring reports, selection and validation of computerized systems. So I must say that all those aspects were known to most of those that were involved in clinical trials. But as I mentioned before, this the GCP revision 3 explains everything about each one of those aspects and provide guidance to both vendors and sponsors on how to behave during a clinical trial. During a clinical trial, you need several vendors and several service providers. I listed here the most relevant and important one. Sometimes for specific clinical trials, you may need more than that or less than that, depends on the phase and the characteristic of the study. So you always need a CRO unless you are a big company and you have all the activities in-house. Data management, central laboratory, and sometimes also you need central radiology and other aspects of the study. Packaging and labeling, storage and distribution, biostatisticians, CDMO or CMO, depends on the stage in which you are in your development. GDPR, on which Diana will expand. Independent Data Monitoring Committee, pharmacovigilance, and auditors. Section 3.2 mentions that the sponsor should ensure that sufficient resources are available and that the sponsor should utilize appropriately qualified individuals for the activities to which they are assigned. So how do we assess the suitability of the service providers? How do we ensure that we have the most experienced and relevant stakeholders to assist us with the trial? The first tool is a quality questionnaire. Usually we send it to the service providers as the first step to have an idea whether this service providers is actually relevant to our study and our needs. On-site or remote audit depends on the activity, the criticality. If we are talking about a manufacturing facility, we will do an on-site visit, an on-site audit. If we are talking about a laboratory, we may do that or may not. And there are other, if we are talking about a biostatistician, going to his office may not provide more information than conducting a remote audit. A review of quality system of the service provider, review of SOPs and performance metrics to understand how the quality system not only is designed, but also how it operates, recommendations from other clients, prior experience of the company. Sometimes we have service providers that we have been working with them in the past. We had good experience with them, so we may go back and ask them to share this new study, and also appropriate accreditation as needed according to the service that is provided. One aspect that is critical for this relationship with the vendors and service providers are the agreements. So an agreement with each service provider vendor should be in place, and the agreement should address conduct of the study in accordance with approved protocol and according to GCP or other regulations that are relevant to the study, comply with procedures for data recording, reporting, and data integrity, retains trial-related records, we need to ensure that the clinical center, the vendors, all of them agree to retain the related records to the trial for the number of years that are dictated by the different regulations. Permit to monitor, audit, and inspection by sponsors, IRB, regulatory authorities. Sometimes in the agreements, we forget to mention that the sponsor or someone on his behalf will be auditing the facility, the sites, the activities, the laboratory. And then when you want to come and audit that specific vendor, you may face some challenges in doing that. Trial-related activities which involve several vendors require special agreements. For example, data transfer agreement. Usually data transfer agreement requires the involvement of the one that is responsible for data management, data acquisition, the involvement of the sites, sometimes of some of the vendors because their data is transferred directly to a database that is being held by somebody else. The issue of language, if we are conducting a multi-center study in different countries, we need to be aware of the languages of each one of those countries and whether we can come to an agreement in which language to report to the database, how to collect the data if the original data is in different languages, the issue of time zones. If I conduct an activity in Israel and now in Spain where Diana is, it's another time. It's another different. There is a difference in the time, and more dramatically when we are talking about Israel and India or Israel and the United States. So all those aspects need to be taken into consideration. And of course, the validation of computerized systems, which is also detailed in details in the GCP guideline. The other statement which is critical to understand or to work accordingly is section 3.6.7, which says a sponsor may transfer any or all the sponsor's trial-related activities to a service provider. However, the ultimate responsibility resides with the sponsor. And that's why we are talking today about the control of vendors and service providers, because it's not just you choose a vendor and then you rely that everything will work as you expected. It might be the case, but what you need to do according to the guidance is that you need to have a control over the sponsors and ensure that everything is really conducted as to your expectations, to the level of compliance that is expected. And another statement by the guidance is in section 3.9.6, oversight by the sponsor includes quality assurance and quality control processes relating to the trial-related activities of investigators and service providers. And also the sponsor should implement an appropriate system to manage quality throughout all stages of the trial process. So how do we do all that? With having in mind that we need to ensure the performance of the vendors, service providers, and the quality oversight. So here are some tools that are recommended, and I'm sure that who is involved may know some of them. Study plans, including source data verification, critical one. The issue of source data verification, data integrity is critical to the success outcome of the study. Reporting procedures, periodic meetings, etc. Quality plans, which addresses tools of quality control. How am I, the sponsor, going to ensure quality control of the processes of the studies? Quality assurance, escalation procedures. What if there is a deviation in one of the clinical sites? What if there is a deviation or violation of regulation at one of the service providers? How do I handle that? What is the escalation procedure? What are the parties involved in investigating and resolving those cases? And the last one is about audit plans. My experience and recommendation would be that once you have signed the agreements with all service providers, you have a protocol available, you develop an audit plan which will guide you through the conduct of the study, and it will detail how many audits you will conduct at critical service providers, at clinical sites. What if you find misconduct in one site, whether you have a need to investigate or evaluate that also in other sites. We had experience with finding deficiencies in the way that documents were handled or documentation was done, and then we understood that maybe the forms that we provided were not appropriate, and there was a need to make changes to the protocol and to the related forms that were used for the study. Those are cases that you will realize and you will identify only when you do audits in at sites. Otherwise, you may not be aware of those kind of things, and you will realize that there were some discrepancies only at the end of the study, when it will be really difficult to address them and correct them. Roy, do I have time for case studies, or?
I think that we can spare a minute or two if.
Okay, so I'll do that really quickly. So the suitability of a vendor. How do I? What are the challenges with that? So we had a case that a sponsor was about to engage in the study, a site that had a warning letter because of an inspection that was conducted by the FDA, which resulted in 483. The answers were not to the FDA satisfaction, and then a warning letter was issued. So one of the things that you need to look into and verify when you try to engage any of the service providers, vendors, or sites is whether they had any inspection by regulatory authorities, whether 483 form or equivalent European or other country the comments, observations were issued, whether there were warning letter, and you need to ensure that none of the persons that are involved in the study is in the debarment list of the FDA. The debarment list is what we call a list of people that already were identified as conducting as with misconduct during the conduct of studies. Another aspect, I will
I'm
go
sorry,
to.
I think that
Okay.
we need to move so we have enough time. If we have time at the end,
At
maybe
the
we can come back to
Okay.
one more or more examples. So thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
And I want to remind everyone that we have the Q&A that you can ask questions that we will answer at the end. And now I want to say that many times our clients come across the privacy issues. They seem to pop up at one point or another in their development process, and then they are a bit startled sometimes on how to work with that. So I'm really, really happy to have you here today, Diana, and you can shed some light on the subject that, of course, there's much to say about it, but at least it's a good place for our audience to start. So please, Diana, go ahead.
So let me. Are you seeing my slides? Okay.
Yes, we can see it.
I cannot see them. So, okay, now I can see. So I'm going to talk about GDPR rules on vendor selection and management and how to protect personal data in clinical trials. Sorry, I cannot move the slides. So I apologize for this, but I cannot. I will stop sharing and share again. Something went wrong. Let me see if I can do it now. Okay. I cannot. Apologize. Try again. Well, what I'm going to do is I will share my screen and then I will share the slides. Can you see it?
Yes, we can see.
Okay, but I cannot change. Okay, now.
Yeah,
Okay.
now it changed.
Good. Sorry, apologize for that.
It's all good. Thank you.
Why GDPR applies to clinical trials. And we have first to think that GDPR applies either if a company established in the European Economic Area or the UK, or if the company, even if it's established in a third country, is processing data from individuals located in the European Economic Area and or the UK. So thinking about sponsors, either located in the European Economic Area or outside of the European Economic Area, but that conduct clinical trials in any of these countries, the clinical trial regulation requires compliance with GDPR. And one of the things that is very common to hear is that, well, we actually don't process personal data. We process only anonymized data. Here's the thing, under the GDPR, and has clarified by the EMEA, when there is a link between the subject ID code and the subject's identity at the clinical level, such data is considered pseudonymized data, so is not anonymized, and is subject to the GDPR. So every stakeholder involved in a clinical trial shall comply with the GDPR when handling personal data, and these include investigators, sponsors, or any third parties that process clinical trial data. But who is the responsible to ensure GDPR compliance in a clinical trial? Well, that is the sponsor. Data controller is the responsible for GDPR compliance during the entire life cycle of the trial, and any vendor involved in the processing of personal data will handle such data on behalf of the sponsor and in compliance with the instructions from the sponsor. So we learn from here that the sponsor is ultimately responsible despite any outsourcing of clinical trial activities to vendors, including the CRO. So considering that the sponsor is the responsible, what are the GDPR rules on vendor selection that apply to the sponsors? On one hand, the GDPR says that we need to perform a due diligence to ensure that vendors apply adequate security measures to protect against data breaches and implement procedures and policies to respect data subject rights. On another hand, we need to execute data processing agreements or data processing clauses included in the vendor agreements to ensure that adequate GDPR provisions are included in vendor contracts. And these are various, but some of them are the rules on engaging with sub-processors, audit rights, and reporting data breaches. And lastly, how to address cross-border transfers. So when a vendor is located in a third country, there are few obligations imposed by the GDPR to ensure that the transfers of personal data to the third country are protected. This includes performing a transfer risk assessment and signing standard contractual clauses when the vendor is located in a country that does not have the equivalent level of protection or is under an adequacy decision issued by the European Commission. So what are now the rules on vendor management? Previously, we've seen the rules on vendor selection. So what we need to do before we actually start processing the data by these vendors. And now what do we need to do regarding vendor management? So a continuous monitoring is essential to ensure that vendors respect the contractual obligations and, of course, comply with applicable regulations. So the performing of audits is essential, and vendors should maintain data protection standards as agreed in the contracts. And also, it is important to exercise controls over subcontractors. So when we sign contracts with vendors, we impose an obligation to ensure vendors will communicate any new subcontractor to the sponsor, and the sponsor is obliged to approve that subcontractor in order to allow the third party to process data on behalf of the vendor. It is very important that during audits, we ensure on one hand that there are no subcontractors that we didn't approve, but also that all the vendors will escalate and request approval every time a new subcontractor is contracted or is expected to be contracted. And now, what does the GDPR says about sponsor accountability obligations? So one of the important rules of the GDPR is that in order to guarantee and ensure compliance, there are some tools that need to be created to demonstrate that the sponsor implements data protection controls during the entire processing of personal data. One of these is the ROPA, is a record of processing activities of the sponsor, and it registers all the processing activities that the sponsor performs. And the other is the Data Protection Impact Assessment, or DPIA. And this is a risk assessment that is performed every time high processing involves high risk to the individuals. So what we need to consider when we draft a DPIA is to add the vendors and analyze the risks these vendors may contribute to the processing activities. So the vendors will be reflected in this DPIA as well as the potential risks for them to process personal data. So now let me say, what are the risks of violations? And if a sponsor says, okay, this is fine, but we don't want to do this because compliance is expensive. So now we have to consider financial penalties. These regarding GDPR vendor rules can lead to significant fines, which can reach up to 20 million or 4% of global annual turnover, whichever is higher. Reputational damage, a GDPR violation can damage sponsors and vendors' reputations, leading to trust issues that undermine patient recruitment and security funding, and increase regulatory scrutiny. So regulators may place additional scrutiny on organizations that have violated GDPR, leading to delays in approvals and more frequent audits. What are the best practices for GDPR compliance? And here I have to say, appoint a data protection officer to oversee the privacy compliance of your organization and of each clinical trial, because each clinical trial imposes different risks, in particular due to different vendors involved. Remember that the CRO is a processor. It is not responsible for sponsors' compliance, and it cannot advise sponsor on how to ensure compliance with the GDPR. This is not legally allowed. And also integrate GDPR oversight in vendor management and quality audits, as this is a huge risk, and considering most of the processing activities are outsourced, it's time effective to put together a quality management team and a DPO to perform an audit together to different vendors. And here's my contact information only. If you have any questions, you can have the information from this webinar available to you. I will stop sharing. And yes.
Thank you, Diana. And it's really interesting to me to see how similar it is, the approach that is required by the sponsors to assure their compliance both with GDPR and GCP. And Mother, if you can please turn back your camera on and unmute. Okay, wonderful. So I do see that we have one question from our audience, so maybe we can start with that, and then if we don't receive any other questions, we can discuss it a bit further, the three of us. So the question is by Inbal Keret. What are the rules for submitting clinical data obtained from a study conducted in Israel to the EU? Additionally, if a European citizen participates in the study, do we need to comply with GDPR regulations? So I understand that it is about the GDPR compliance. So Diana, I don't know if you can see the question as well. Okay.
Yes, I can see, and I can answer regarding GDPR compliance, because the rules for submitting clinical data obtained from a study conducted in Israel to the EU is about regulatory submission. But regarding compliance with GDPR, what I have to say is it depends if the individual is based in the European Union and the trial is conducted in the European Union. For example, if an Israeli sponsor is conducting a clinical trial in Spain, and I participate in that trial, the Israeli sponsor is subject to the GDPR. But if I, Spanish citizen, live in Israel, you don't need to comply with GDPR if the clinical trial is conducted in Israel. So it's about the targets of the trial. If you're running the trial in Europe, for sure, even if you are a foreigner sponsor, a foreigner company, you are subject to the GDPR.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Mother, if you can unmute or maybe your speaker is up, so we can hear you.
Sorry. So I wanted to add to that, Diana. What if a study is conducted in the European Union aiming to submit the data only to the FDA? So the GDPR also applies to that study?
If the study is conducted in the European Union, yes.
Okay, thank you.
If I understand, the general rule is that GDPR is aimed to protect the privacy of the citizens of the European Union. So once their data is collected, it doesn't matter why it is collected, it needs to comply with the GDPR demands. And we actually received another question from our audience. This one is from Shmulik Adler, again about GDPR. Can you give example for points to consider as part of GDPR audit? I would assume this is probably rather broad, and there are
Yeah, but
probably
I can
quite a few,
answer.
but
Yes.
yeah.
So one of the things that I always ask is and review is the policies and procedures that are implemented by the organization regarding the processing of personal data. For example, there are three main policies and procedures that I always recommend. One is a general privacy policy. How do an organization deals with personal data? And how the organization complies with the data protection regulation. The second is the personal data breaches SOP. And basically, this one will guide the organization on identification and reporting and mitigation and notification of a personal data breach to the authorities or individuals, if applicable. And the third one is data subject requests rights SOP. So under the GDPR, data subjects have rights, right to deletion, right to access, a right to object to the processing between others. And organizations, in order to comply with GDPR, must have an SOP to guide the organization on how to identify a request from an individual and on how to respond to such requests. This is one of the aspects. Another aspect is the security measures an organization implements to protect data. And this includes different measures. So not only about the access rights and who can review what, but also about the implementation of virus software, antivirus software, the backups, the necessary backups that an organization needs to have in order to avoid the unavailability of the data between others. So usually what I do with my clients is that I have a questionnaire that I prepare to audit each vendor that is participating in a clinical trial, and that questionnaire is answered, is reviewed, and is approved. And this is part of the accountability documents the sponsors have included in their GDPR folder in case an authority comes to inspect compliance.
Okay, thank you very much. I have a couple of more questions, but one question that just came to my mind, and I hope that you're fine with me being spontaneous. It's for both of you. Could there be a situation in which there would be a contradiction between the demands of the GDPR and GCP? And if such a situation could arise, how should it be addressed?
So no, the thing is, and I don't know if it was for me or Rivka. Rivka, let me just answer that one, and then maybe you can add. But the thing is, the GDPR is a regulation that is drafted for all industries, and GCP is specific for clinical trials. So GCP rules in terms of clinical trials, and GDPR rules in terms of processing of personal data. When we join them, they shouldn't be contradictory. The GDPR allows also some exceptions to GDPR obligations when or rules when we are in scope of scientific research. For example, it allows sponsors to not respect our individuals' rights if they are participants in the research and if the data is needed for the research. So this regarding the deletion of the data after withdrawal. So a participant can withdraw the study, data cannot be processed from that moment on, but the data that was previously collected is useful for the trial, and there is an exception to the right of deletion, and the sponsor is allowed to keep that data in line with GDPR and with GCP.
Yeah, so I agree with that, and my answer was also no, there are no contradiction. Actually, there are aspects of GDPR that were originally part of GCP regulation, and just the GDPR legislation expanded that to a level that is needed. But the issue of privacy and keeping the rights of all those involved in a study was there in the GCP. So I don't see any contradiction.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you for this. And another question. What key factors should small biopharma companies consider when selecting vendors? And what lessons can be learned from the mistakes of others that you encountered along the way? So maybe, Mother, you can start, and then Diana, we will love to hear from you as well.
Yeah. So I think that the most important thing that a small company needs to take into account, that when talking about the responsibility of the sponsor, the regulation doesn't care if it is a small company or a big pharma. So the issue of taking the responsibility on the quality of the study and the integrity of the data is with the sponsor, and therefore the first rule that should be within the sponsor or contracted by the sponsor is a rule of the quality, a quality person that will be able to assess the different vendors and service providers and work with the sponsor in order to establish everything that is relevant to their activities. For instance, we have a list of a few SOPs, 5 or 6 SOPs, if I'm not mistaken, that are basic SOPs for the conduct of any study from phase 1 onwards. And it depends on whether you conduct more activities within your organization, then you expand the SOPs. And if not, you rely on the SOPs of your vendors, but you first evaluate that. You ensure that they have the right procedures in order and quality system in order to be part of your study. But at the end of the day, the quality person in the sponsor organization is a key one in order to comply with the guideline requirements.
Thank you. And Diana, if we can get your perspective on the key factors to be considered when selecting vendors.
So apart from those that I have mentioned, due diligence, contracts, and cross-border transfers, for me, it's very important that a sponsor not only appoints a DPO that is responsible for the oversight of vendors and the compliance of the organization, but also that invests in GDPR training. Because even though the DPO is responsible for the oversight of compliance, it is very important that the organization understands how GDPR applies. And I had situations where I asked about contracts signed with vendors, and one of my clients said, well, this vendor is not going to process personal data, but because we are in conversations to expand their services and to implement their services in a specific study, let's do the analysis, let's do the due diligence and let's create contracts ready to when that moment comes. And this is a sponsor that I said is aware and knowledgeable about GDPR, because they understand that you have to do these things before you actually process the data. So it's not when you start processing the data, it's already late. So GDPR is about prevention, and it starts before the processing of personal data. And so organizations need to be aware of how GDPR applies and in which particular cases it applies and what are the obligations. So this is training, and training, because the majority of the people working in clinical trials don't have a legal or privacy background, but GDPR is not so difficult to understand. And so everybody can at least have a general idea of how this applies and be supportive of the privacy compliance work at the organization. So the DPO cannot do it by himself or herself. We need the entire organization has supportives and collaborators to implement a robust privacy program.
Thank you very much. And with that, our time is up. But if I can add just to what you last said, Diana, it's a lot about training, but there are specialists that can assist the sponsors and walk them through the process and guide them and assure that they are compliant. And of course, you provide these services, and we for the GCP. And everyone, please feel free to contact Diana. We will send you the presentations of Diana and my mother's lectures today, and a recording of this session as well. And I feel that there was a lot of interest in the topic. So please feel free to write either to Diana or to me about other topics that you would want us to cover around compliance. And I'm sure that Diana will be happy to join us for another webinar. I can say that it was a pleasure for me.
A pleasure for me too.
Thank you very much for your time, and thank you also, Mother, and thank you everybody for joining us today. And just a reminder that next week we'll have the third session of the data integrity series that I'm giving. So please, you're all welcome to join us then as well. Have a good afternoon, everybody.
Question.
Yes.